Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival and to this University of Edinburgh event, New York Storyteller with Paul Auster. I'm Jackie McGlone, and it is the most immense pleasure and privilege for me to introduce Paul Auster to you this evening. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Jackie.
I am not going to sit here and talk about Paul's achievements because we'd be here all evening, and you don't want that. You want to be here all evening, but for other reasons you want to hear him. But suffice to say that Paul is one of the greatest American novelists of our time. His work has been garlanded with prizes, and this evening he comes to us with his 17th, forgive me if I don't pick it up, and greatest novel. 4321. It tells of a smart kid, Archie Ferguson from New Jersey, who grows up in 4 different ways with 4 separate destinies laid down by the same genetic material. It offers, wrote the Financial Times reviewer, a wide-angle panoramic view of American life between 1947 and 1971, and is also a vastly magnified chamber piece. The critic added that Auster can out-Roth, out-Updike, and out-Franzen, all the greatest as a richly textured chronicler of modern America in transit and in crisis. While the New York Times critic wrote, 4321 is a work of outsized ambition and remarkable craft, a monumental assemblage of competing and complementary fictions that contain multitudes. This evening, Paul will read from 4321, and we will talk about it and other matters. Regrettably, we will probably just have time for a couple of questions, but you can, of course, talk to Paul and meet him when he does his signing afterwards. Finally, please switch off mobile phones, and please do not tweet until the lights go up for audience questions. And also, we'd be most grateful if you would not leave before the event is ended, however pressing your next engagement. So, ladies and gentlemen, Paul Auster.
I'm going to read a brief passage from about 2/3 of the way into the book. Not very long at all. It's 1968. This is one of the Fergusons. He's about 20 years old, on the brink of 21, and he's a student at Columbia University, a place where there was much chaos during those years. And this is his vision of what's going on in early 1968. Ferguson saw the situation as a series of concentric circles. The outer circle was the war and all that went with it. American soldiers in Vietnam, enemy combatants from the north and the south, Viet Cong, Ho Chi Minh, the government in Saigon, Lyndon Johnson and his cabinet, U.S. foreign policy since the end of World War II, body counts, napalm, burning villages, hearts and minds, escalation, pacification, peace with honor. The second circle represented America, the 200 million on the home front, the press, newspapers, magazines, radio, television, the anti-war movement, the pro-war movement, the Black Power movement, the counterculture movement, hippies and yippies, pot and LSD, rock and roll, the underground press, Zap Comics, the Merry Pranksters, the Motherfuckers. That was an anarchist group. The Hard Hats and the Love It or Leave It crowd. The empty air occupied by the so-called generation gap between middle-class parents and their children. And the vast throng of nameless citizens who came to be known as the silent majority. The third circle was New York, which was almost identical to the second circle, but more immediate, more vivid, a laboratory filled with examples of the aforementioned social currents that Ferguson could perceive directly with his own eyes rather than through the filter of written words or published images, all the while taking into account the nuances and particularities of New York itself, which was different from all the other cities in the United States, especially because of the enormous divide between rich and poor. The fourth circle was Columbia, Ferguson's temporary abode, the close-to-hand little world that surrounded him and his fellow students, the encompassing ground of an institution no longer walled off from the big world outside it, for the walls had come down and the outside was now indistinguishable from the inside. The fifth circle was the individual, each individual person in any one of the four other circles. But in Ferguson's case, the individuals who counted most were the ones he knew personally. Above all, the friends he shared his life with at Columbia. And above all those others, of course, the individual of individuals, the dot at the center of the smallest of the five circles, the person who was himself. 5 realms, 5 separate realities, but each one was connected to the others, which meant that when something happened in the outer circle, the war, its effects could be felt throughout America, New York, Columbia, and every last dot in the inner circle of private individual lives. When the war escalated in the spring of 1967, for example, 500,000 people marched in the streets of New York. And on April 15th, to condemn the war and call for the immediate withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. 5 days after that, on the Columbia campus uptown, 300 members of SDS, that's Students for Democratic Society, it was a left-wing anti-war student organization, 300 members of SDS showed up at John Jay Hall to ask, quote, ask some questions of the Marine recruiters who had set up their tables in the lobby and were attacked by a charging gang of 50 jocks and NROTC, that is Naval Reserve Officers Training Corps, which was something that was present on U.S. campuses back then. 50 jocks, those are the athletes, 50 jocks and NROTC boys, which led to a bloody scuffle of flying fists and bashed-in noses that had to be broken up by the police. The following afternoon, the largest demonstration at Columbia in over 30 years was held in the Van Am Quadrangle between John Jay and Hamilton Halls, as 800 members and supporters of SDS protested Marine recruiting on campus, and 500 pro-Marine jock hecklers threw eggs at them from the other side of the fence on South Field in their own counter-demonstration. Ferguson and Amy's his girlfriend, had both been involved in that hectic scene. She as a participant, Amy's a member of SDS, and he as a witness reporter, he writes for the student newspaper, had both been involved in that hectic scene. She as a participant and he as a witness reporter. And when he told her about his concentric circles theory that night at the West End, a bar that everyone went to back then, she smiled at him and said, "But of course, my dear Holmes, how clever of you." The point was that no one was happy on either side. The pro-war people were becoming more and more frustrated by Johnson's failure to win the war. And the anti-war people were becoming more and more frustrated by their failure to force Johnson to end the war. Meanwhile, the war continued to grow. 500,000 troops, 550,000 troops. And the bigger it became, the more the outer circle pressed in on the other circles, squeezing them ever more tightly. And before long, the spaces between them had shrunk to the merest slivers of air, which was making it hard for the lone ones trapped in the center to breathe. And when a person can't breathe, he starts to panic. And panic is something close to craziness, a feeling that you have lost your mind and are about to die. And by early 1968, Ferguson was beginning to feel that everyone had gone crazy, as crazy as the crazy people who talked out loud to themselves on Broadway, and bit by bit, he had become as crazy as everyone else. Then, in the early months of the new year, everything began to snap. The shock attacks by Viet Cong sapper commandos on more than 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns during the Tet Offensive of January 30th proved that America could never win the war. Even though American troops fought back and overwhelmed the enemy in every battle of the offensive, killing 37,000 Viet Cong compared to the 2,000 lost by the U.S., with tens of thousands of other Viet Cong fighters either wounded or captured, and 500,000 South Vietnamese civilians turned into homeless refugees. The message to the American public was that the North Vietnamese would never give up, that they would go on fighting until the last person in their country was dead. And how many more American soldiers would it take to destroy that country? Would the 500,000 already there have to be increased to 1 million, to 2 million, to 3 million? And if so, would the destruction of North Vietnam not also mean the destruction of America? 2 months later, Johnson appeared on television and announced that he would not be running for re-election in the fall. It was an admission of failure, an acknowledgement that public support for the war had eroded to such a point that his policies had been rejected. And Ferguson, who had admired the good Johnson of the War on Poverty and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and had loathed the bad Johnson of Vietnam, found himself in the uncomfortable position of feeling sorry for the President of the United States, at least for a minute or two, as he tried to put himself in the head of Lyndon Johnson and experience the anguish he must have felt in deciding to abdicate his throne. And then Ferguson felt glad, both glad and relieved that LBJ would soon be gone. 5 days after that, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. Another bullet fired by an American nobody. Another blow to the collective nervous system. And then hundreds of thousands of people ran out into the streets and started smashing windows and setting buildings on fire. 128 Newarks, where there had been a terrible riot the year before. 128 Newarks. The 5 concentric circles had merged into a single disc. It was an LP record now, and the song it kept playing was an old blues number called "Can't Take It No More Sugar, 'Cause My Heart Hurts So Bad."
Thank you, Paul. In the light of that reading, may we talk about something that I think is rarely acknowledged and an influence on your work, and that is the legacy of the Second World War. The narrative of imposed on it was one of straightforward heroism, and this was promulgated in movies and novels at the time. And then along comes Archie's generation, your generation, because indeed the Archies are only, is it a month older or younger?
They're a month younger than I am. Yes.
A month younger. And on that generation, you faced a much more ambiguous challenge, the refusal to fight on moral grounds, which could be construed as cowardice by some of those men who had fought and who they'd admired as boys. So this is a very long question. Doesn't the longing, though, for that less complicated, more satisfying story persist with Archie's story? Because after all, he tells us he wants to be the hero of his own life.
Well, by becoming the hero of his own life, he's referring to Dickens, of course, David Copperfield. Yeah. And that particular Archie, who says that to himself, has been reading Dickens and loves it. So I'm not sure, he's not talking about military heroism there. But you know, being born in early 1947 means I was... it was only 18 months after the war ended that I first saw the light in this strange world that I still inhabit. We entered a whole new period. By we, I mean everybody in the world. World War II had been probably the most devastating catastrophe we had ever visited upon one another, with tens of millions of people slaughtered. Large parts of the world in utter ruin. And then began this new thing called the Cold War, which soon manifested itself in the struggles in Berlin, the divided Berlin, and the four major powers each had a sector in Berlin. The Russian sector, the American, the British, and the French. And then the Russians created a blockade, and then there was an airlift of food into the other zones. And so the USSR and the West were beginning to split. We had all been allies against the Germans in World War II, but that had ended. And by 1950, the Korean War started. Now, the Korean War is the forgotten war of American history. There were British and French troops there as well, and troops from many other countries. It was officially a UN action, but the bulk of the troops were American, and a lot of people were killed. It was a devastating war, and finally it ended in a stalemate, and the two Koreas were kept divided. Well, as we know, it has not been resolved. If you're reading the news now, you know that this is still one of the hot points on the globe, North and South Korea. America developed a vicious, crazy, anti-communist ethos in the country, leading to literally the purges of people in what we call the Red Scare and the blacklist. I'm sure most of you are aware of, Hollywood people being kicked out and for having once been members of the Communist Party, say 20 years before when they were young. And teachers were fired. There was a real purge throughout the United States, and fear everywhere. And somehow, I grew up in this era of air raid shelters with nuclear destruction looming. We would have these air raid drills in elementary school, as if sitting with our hands over our heads in the hallway of the school was going to prevent us from being wiped out by a nuclear weapon. And then there were bomb shelters. People were building bomb shelters all over the United States. And then phrases such as, and I grew up with this, better dead than red. Yeah? Maybe you had this in England too. Yeah. So it was a Cold War in that we weren't exchanging fire, but it was very heated. And then came the Domino Theory. This became the principal philosophy of the Defense Department and the State Department in the United States, which was if one country goes communist, then the next country will go communist, and therefore they'll all start falling like dominoes. That was the reasoning that got the United States into Vietnam. Vietnam, which had been under French control for many years, known as Indochina then, and in 1954, the Vietnamese defeated the French, who were booted out, and the country was divided in two, and there was supposed to be an election in 2 years. Well, U.S. got involved, and then we got more involved, and by the early 60s, we were there, and by the mid-60s, we were fighting a major war that we knew nothing about. We had no understanding of the country, no understanding of what we were doing there, and the idiocy of this war, which I do believe tore the country apart in such ways that we've never fully repaired since. This Vietnam War was our great tragedy as a country. And therefore, we, the young people at the time, huge numbers of us in any case, maybe half of us, felt that the war was not only wrong but immoral. And so a resistance against the war grew up, and I was certainly part of that. And the Fergusons are all against the war, but of course there were many for it, and there were many volunteering to go fight. And the devastation was so enormous, and it went on and on and on, and no matter what, it seemed that the war was never going to end. It wasn't just 1 or 2 years, but it lasted until 1975 is when the war officially ended, when the North finally conquered the South, and that was it. American troops stopped fighting in 73. But that means that we had all been protesting for 10 years. So our entire youths were given over to opposing the war.
When did you start protesting?
When did I stop protesting? Actively stopped when I moved to France. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get out of America. And I luckily was not drafted. We had a lottery was set up, and I got a very high number. And I knew that I wasn't going to have to deal with the problem of leaving the country or going to prison. Those are my two options. And every young man of my generation had that choice. Go into the army, go to jail, or run away. Those are the only three things you could do. So I was lucky in that I got a very high number and didn't have to worry about it anymore. And eventually I packed my bags and I left. I needed to get out of America. It was choking me by then. This was early 71.
Okay.
Early 71, yeah.
Mm-hmm. A few years ago, you published 2 fragments of autobiography, Winter Journal and Report from the Interior, in which you recalled sensations and thought patterns of childhood. And I wondered whether these books were almost the genesis of 4321, because you were obviously dwelling in, if you forgive me, the long ago of America, your childhood.
Yes. You're right. You're absolutely
writing.
right. In retrospect, I realized that those 2 books were plowing the ground for this, but I didn't know it at the time, of course.
No.
But writing Winter Journal and then Report from the Interior, that was the first time in my adult life that I had seriously looked back on my own childhood and thought about it at length, and realized what a rich territory it was and how much I could still bring back. While much of it is utterly erased and irretrievable, there was enough for me to feel a sense of what it had been like to be the little me all those years before. And I think you're right. I think this inspired me to go back into those early years of childhood and early and youth and explore them. And I think that's why I did this book.
And did you know when you sat down to write this, Paul, that it was going to be 866 pages long?
I didn't have a precise page count, Jackie.
Well, I only ask because you started it when you were 66,
yes, and
your father died when he was 66.
Well, yes.
I think having sex with his girlfriend, wasn't he, at the time?
A terrible way to die. Just you've done your homework.
I always do, you know.
Yeah, I know. Well, yes, I had turned 66, which was the age my father was when he died. And I don't know how many of you have outlived parents, so to speak, but it's an eerie boundary to pass. And I felt that for a good year or so, all that year that I was 66, I kept thinking, well, my number's coming up any moment now. And I started this book and I thought I better get down to work and really work hard at it. Because I imagined it would take me 5 or 6 years to do this. But I pretty much pushed away everything. I didn't do much but write the book, pretty much 7 days a week. So instead of 5 or 6 years, I did it in 3.5. And I'll tell you, it was physically draining. And the last day, when I wrote the last sentence, and I got up from the chair at my desk, I almost fell on the floor. I was so exhausted. I was dizzy, and I had to grab onto the chair so that it didn't fall. But I did it. I crossed the finish line, and I'm still here to tell the tale, which is pretty amazing.
Now, the writing process, you've always used a typewriter, an elderly Olympia, haven't you? I have seen it. You have paintings of it in your house, a sculpture. You wrote a book with Sam Messer, who did the painting. Did you write this on the typewriter?
Well, actually, I write everything with a fountain pen.
So you wrote this in longhand?
I write everything in longhand. And the way I compose a book or anything, even an essay, is I write paragraph by paragraph with pen. And then I revise, I cross out. Maybe I'll rewrite the paragraph until it seems reasonably okay. And then it's almost indecipherable at that moment. I turn around and I type it up on the old Olympia.
Can you get ribbons?
I have a source. And I have a lot of them. And I don't know if the source is still there, but I think when I get home, I'm going to check just to make sure. And then I type up, and then I can see it clean. I start making more changes in the paragraph. So when that typed version seems reasonably finished, I go back to the notebook and then write the next paragraph. It's just a method. There's no right or wrong about it.
Ever used a word processor of any?
Yes, I've tried, and I didn't like it. I tried with the best will in the world, but I didn't like it. I felt that I didn't like the keyboard. There wasn't enough resistance, and my hands started to hurt. Whereas with my old manual, I'm banging away, building up my muscles as I'm working. Yes.
And tell me, was it immensely liberating for you? Because you're a very elegant, concise writer. Not that this is not elegantly written, but to write sentences that sometimes go on for 3 pages, as they do in this book.
Well,
they snake away across all these pages.
This is something that had been building up in, I think, the 4 previous books I had written. A new approach to the sentence, and. Well, what else do we do? We write sentences. That's what novelists do. And in the novel Invisible, which I suppose I wrote about 10 years ago. I can't remember exactly. It started to change. I started writing a different kind of sentence. Not every sentence, but it had a kind of propulsion. These longer run-on sentences, a paratactic urgency, and I then wrote another novel, Sunset Park, and then there was the 2 other books you mentioned, the autobiographical books. All of them have these long sentences, and in this book, I wanted to create a tone, and I think the longer sentences helped set this up. I mean, the very first phrase in the novel is, according to family legend. And I wanted to set up this feeling that we're listening to a very old tale. And, there's a lot of telling in this novel, not a lot of dialogue, and not a lot of individual scenes even. I mean, there are many when you add them all up, but it's a very old form of storytelling, which predates the novel, I believe, and I think these long sentences helped to push pushed me through, and I think helped push the reader through all these words, all these incidents, all this stuff that happens in so many pages.
And did you always know how it would end? I'm always fascinated about how a writer sits down and begins a novel. Would you always know the end?
I wasn't sure. At first, I thought I would take the boys.
The end is terrific.
Yeah, well, I didn't find the end until I was about halfway, maybe even 2/3 through. I wasn't sure. My first impulse was to take them much deeper into their lives. Mm-hmm. But then as I started writing the book, I realized, no, this is a book about youth and development, human development. And to take them much past their early 20s wouldn't have been interesting, because we don't change as rapidly after that. What I was so fascinated by, and am still, is what it's like. I mean, the first 10 years of our lives, for example. Think of what happens to us. We go from, utterly helpless little creatures into thinking children who can do so many things. And then when we get to 20, we're more or less formed. And then the rest is kind of the final touches, you might say. And after that, yes, we all change and we all continue to change, but not with the abrupt shifts that we experience when we're young. So it's a book about youth. And so then I realized, all right, I'll stop it at a certain point. And then I began to understand how the book might end. But it was only then that I began to get it. And
is there a chance there could be another one?
Oh, I thought about it, but I don't want to do it. No.
Nah. Too tiring.
No, I just don't want to do it. I think it's fun. The first paragraph of the book begins with a joke about Rockefeller.
Do you want to read that first paragraph?
Sure, I'd be
please?
happy to. And it begins with a joke. It's an old joke, which I never knew until a couple of years before I started this book. In the joke that I heard, the first name of the character was different. But I did some digging into Yiddish, and I was able to find a different construction that gave me what I wanted. I should also say, the Empress of China, the name of the ship. You see, this comes from a wonderful book I read years and years ago. Irving Howe was a very fine literary critic and social historian, wrote a huge book, as big as this, maybe bigger, called The World of Our Fathers, which is the story of Jewish immigration in New York. It's a terrific book. And at one chapter, he talks about the Yiddish press in New York City. Well, so the Yiddish journalists were always scanning the English language papers for ideas for stories, but not always understanding English. And one journalist reported by Howe sees a headline, Empress of China on maiden voyage to America. The ship. And so then the Yiddish paper prints the next day, Empress of China coming to New York looking for a husband. So I thought it's a wonderful misunderstanding of language, and you'll see in this first paragraph why I put it in. So, according to family legend, Ferguson's grandfather departed on foot from his native city of Minsk with 100 rubles sewn into the lining of his jacket, traveled west to Hamburg through Warsaw and Berlin, and then booked passage on a ship called the Empress of China, which crossed the Atlantic in rough winter storms and sailed into New York Harbor on the first day of the 20th century. While waiting to be interviewed by an immigration official at Ellis Island, he struck up a conversation with a fellow Russian Jew. The man said to him, "Forget the name Reznikov. It won't do you any good here. You need an American name for your new life in America, something with a good American ring to it." Since English was still an alien tongue to Isaac Reznikov in 1900, he asked his older, more experienced compatriot for a suggestion. "Tell them you're Rockefeller," the man said. "You can't go wrong with that." An hour passed, then another hour. And by the time the 19-year-old Reznikov sat down to be questioned by the immigration official, he had forgotten the name the man had told him to give. "Your name?" the official asked. Slapping his head in frustration, the weary immigrant blurted out in Yiddish, "Ich hab vergessen." I've forgotten. And so it was that Isaac Reznikov began his new life in America as Ichabod Ferguson. And so the book ends with Rockefeller, too. Yeah. Yeah.
There are more jokes as well.
Oh, there's a lot of joking.
Yeah, a lot of jokes.
Yeah.
I would like to, before we talk about some other things, I'm very keen to talk to you about. In the book, in the summer of '61, if you've mentioned the Cold War already was hotting up abroad, and racist thugs were running amok in America. And Archie reflects that this climate, and I'm quoting, of menace, despondency and hatred proves that rational men were not in charge of running the universe. Now, I know that was probably written long before present events, which we shall return to.
Yes.
We shall return to, I promise you. But before we discuss the world today, I would like to ask you about something. Throughout this book, there is a theme of racism. It's not a huge theme, but it is one of the many themes in the book. And yet, oddly enough, I have not found a single review that mentions this.
No.
And indeed, the many interviews you've done, because you told me you've been very obedient.
I told Jackie yesterday.
You've been very obedient and done everything the publishers told you to do. But nobody has asked you about this. Why?
Nothing. I have no idea. I mean, to say the interviewers in England and America, the people I've talked to from newspapers and magazines, have all been white people. And maybe it's too delicate a subject for them to want to get into. I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't read the reviews, so I don't know what the reviews have said, but I doubt that no one has said to me that anyone brought this up. Black-white relations are a significant thread that runs through the entire book.
Yeah.
As you say, it's not the dominant subject of the novel, but it's significant. And I'm somehow stunned that no one talks about it. I mean, there's everything from the civil rights movement, which is discussed in some detail in different moments of the four Fergusons' lives. There is a whole scene of tremendous focus on Martin Luther King's famous speech at Washington. But more personally, there is the experiences of the different Fergusons with black people. Ferguson 1, who asks a black girl out on a date in high school, and who's refused. She turns him down. Another Ferguson's stepsister gets a black boyfriend, and this causes a lot of anxiety in the family. Another one of the Fergusons, who turns out to be bisexual, has a very ardent affair in Paris with someone who's half black, half white, French Canadian. And all these things are elaborated in some detail. So I think it's important to mention it. Plus, even though Ferguson shares my geography and chronology, this is not an autobiographical book. I'm not this kid. But there are one or two things I took straight from my own experience, one of them being a basketball game that I describe in the book. And I think it's Ferguson 4 who's involved in it. This is something that happened to me in 1961, perhaps the first days of 1962. I played on a team sponsored by a Y. In my case, a YMHA, the Jewish Y. And we would play YMCAs around the New Jersey towns and cities where I grew up. We had one game in Newark, downtown Newark, against an all-black team, and we were all white. And there were 3 games scheduled that morning and afternoon, back to back to back. And we were the first game. Therefore, there were a lot of people watching a lot of the kids who were going to play in the other games, and parents, friends, siblings, who knows, maybe 90 or 100 people watching. And in our game, no one was paying attention at all. They were just waiting for the next game. But the game ended and we were tied. And then, so people started to root. Since everyone in the audience was black, they were rooting for the black team. Then after the first overtime, it was tied. And people started getting more agitated, rooting for the other team to beat us. But after the first overtime, we went a second overtime, tied. So we went into a third overtime. By then, the place was crazy with noise and shouting, and the coach told us we were losing with 10 seconds to go, losing by 1 point, and we had the ball. We had a timeout, and he said, listen, it's really getting scary in here. So you see that door? When the game ends, I want you all just to run right through that door and get into my station wagon, and we'll get out of here. And so the most improbable thing happened. It's really one of the funniest, strangest things I've ever seen. We take the ball out. We somehow manage to break the full court press, and the ball is thrown to one of the kids. And he's at half court, and there's 1 or 2 seconds to go, and he just flung the ball up, swish, and we won at the buzzer. And the moment that happened, everyone poured out. They wanted to kill us. And we escaped. We got out. And this near race riot made a huge impression on me. And sounds like the Cold War is starting again. Made a big impression on me. But in the novel, Ferguson gets punched by somebody, which becomes significant. But I never got punched. I took it, into the world of fiction with the punch. But that's the only personal experience told pretty much verbatim in the whole big novel.
You mentioned the Newark Riots as well.
Yes.
Because you've written about the Newark Riots before, haven't you?
I have. In Man in the Dark.
Yeah, Man in the Dark.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, this was a big deal. I was 20. It was 1967. My mother and father had divorced. My mother had remarried, and she and her husband lived in Newark. And I go into it at great length in the novel about how it started. But it was really a bloody battle between white National Guardsmen, white New Jersey state troopers, and the black population of Newark. Newark was a city of about 500,000 then, so about the size of Edinburgh, but half the population was black. And nearly every one of those 250,000 people was poor. And it was a rough place. And the unfairness of the whole system in Newark seemed to be primed to set up some kind of conflagration. And it happened. A taxi driver, black taxi driver, somehow passed a police car in a way that they thought was illegal. And they arrested him and started roughing him up. And word got out that he had been killed. And so this is what started the riot. In fact, he hadn't been killed. But it lasted for 6 days. And 26 people were killed. Thousands of people were injured. There were millions and millions of dollars worth of property damage. And it was horrific. And Newark has never fully recovered from this. Later that same summer, Detroit also went up in flames.
I remember you telling me, though, that you went to the jail and saw...
Well, my stepfather, you see, worked as he was a lawyer, a labor lawyer, but he also worked, he had an extra job as the Corporation Counsel of Newark. So he was like the city's lawyer. And so I was actually, my mother and stepfather came to New York. They took me out to dinner that night. And then they were going to drive me home. And then my stepfather had a city car with a walkie-talkie in it, and he heard about what was going on. He said, "I'm sorry, we've got to go to Newark." And so we went right in to City Hall. There was the mayor, who died in jail for graft, I should say, later. But there he was, sitting at the desk crying, saying to my stepfather, Norman, what can I do? What can I do?" We went down to the jails underneath City Hall, and they were packed with black men, every cell. And every man was bleeding. Every man had been beaten up by the police. Mm-hmm. It was horrible.
And Paul, nothing has changed. We know because Black Lives Matter.
Well, this is the thing that I'm writing this book. Originally, I thought I was going to use the title Ferguson.
Yeah.
Then, a year and a half into writing the book, I learned, along with everyone else in America who wasn't from Missouri, that there was a town, Ferguson, Missouri. And in that town, this awful event took place of a white policeman shooting and killing an unarmed black young man, and which triggered off similar kinds of responses to the ones we had lived through 50 years before. And not only did I have to change the title of my book, but I felt we haven't gotten anywhere. We're just exactly where we were half a century ago. Nothing has changed. And then, you start to question the very fundamentals, building blocks of the country. Mm-hmm. And we are built, this great country of America, nevertheless is built on two crimes, two enormous sins. The extermination of Indians and slavery of black people. And we've never really faced up to these things. We've never confronted them. And I think it's poisoned us. And now it's coming out more and more and more again. It's another wave of racism and nationalism of the ugliest sort.
I think you've said, actually, make America great again really means make America white again.
That's what he was saying all through the campaign, if you just listen carefully enough.
So I'm going to quote something that the very young Philip Roth wrote about 50 years ago in an essay called Writing American Fiction. And he wrote, "American reality stupefies, it sickens, it infuriates, and finally it is even a kind of embarrassment to one's meager imagination. The actuality is continually outdoing our talents, and the culture tosses up daily characters that are the envy of any novelist." If that was so then...
Well, this is a famous essay, and people keep referring to it.
Yeah.
It seems that Philip was somehow saying that, novelists can't possibly compete with the crazy reality of the United States, but he certainly, over the next 45 years, tried to disprove his own theory. And so I wouldn't take it too seriously, what he said. And I've never agreed with this. It's a beautifully written thing.
Yeah.
But I just feel he's wrong. And he knows better, too. And his life after that essay proves that he knows he was wrong.
Could you ever have invented a character so preposterous and so psychopathic as Donald Trump, do you think?
Well,
do you think anyone would have believed you?
Well, I think Alfred Jarry did it in around 1895 when he invented King Ubu. I don't know if anyone's aware of this play, which is maybe the
frequently
first
done in
modernist
Edinburgh,
play.
In the festival over the years. Yeah.
Well, Ubu is a king, and he is a kind of infant tyrant, just the way Trump is. I mean, there are great similarities. And so, it's been done. We've seen it. We're just seeing again, but never before has Ubu had orange hair. That's it, right? Uh-huh.
Or an orange face.
Yeah, right.
And an enormous red tie for some reason.
Yeah, hanging over his enormous belly. Yes, yes.
I don't we would want to go there, really. You've said you're going to stand up, you're going to speak out, you're never going to shut up about the situation. I mean...
Well, I think we have to
make a difference?
Well, I don't know. I doubt it, because the problem, or one of the problems, is that America, again, is divided in half, as it was 50 years ago, and the two sides can't talk to each other. So whatever I have to say to someone who doesn't agree with me, I don't think is going to have much effect on that person. But I just can't be quiet. It's too dangerous. It's too serious for us to stand back and just watch the country melt. I mean, I think that even in these 6 months, even though Trump has not been able to pass any major legislation because he's so inept.
He's sacking people, isn't he?
He's so inept, and this is maybe his sheer incompetence is helping us on the other side so far. But just by a few strokes of the pen, he's undone nearly all of the, for example, ecological improvements that Obama had instituted. They're erased. He's pulled us out of the Paris Accord on global warming. And bit by bit, if he, stays in power, which I fully expect him to, a lot of the American system is going to be eroded by the time he leaves office. And so I think we have to keep speaking out and keep beating drums and yelling and hope that finally, maybe these right-wing reactionary Republicans will get so fed up themselves that they'll turn against him. But so far, I see almost no evidence that this will happen because they are really scary themselves, frightening people.
Yeah.
And they glorify and glory in their own ignorance and stupidity about the world, their own lack of compassion, their own cruelty to others. And they think this is, shrinking government is the only thing that they're in office for, to, hurt people. And it's that simple, really.
So are you pessimistic about the future?
Well, I've always been pessimistic. And yet, we're still here for the time being. I think things do swing back and forth, but I'm not in an overly optimistic state of mind, I must say. It's depressing.
Well, we've got time for a couple of questions, please. So we'll bring a microphone to you. We have someone here, please.
Thank you. You've explained something that I didn't understand. I'm a bit of a groupie of yours. When I read 4321, I thought it was a bit self-indulgent, but I realized that was my problem because I'm your age and I went through, not quite as actively as you, but the same sort of situations. Now, but fortunately, by listening to you, I realized for some reason I missed the racism bit, almost as if my white Jewish middle-class background sort of selected it out. Tell me, has anybody else sort of challenged you about this word self-indulgence?
You know what? I don't read the reviews of my books because it's not worth it. It's too painful. If you know, there are always people who have attacked me ever since I started writing. I don't need to read that. And if I'm not going to read the bad stuff, why read the good stuff? Because so I don't know what people are saying.
Sorry, yes, this gentleman. Yeah.
2008 and Obama, and no change. Any comments on that?
What do you mean, no change?
Well, we're further away than we were then.
Well, you understand that Trump, I believe, is the Obama backlash. There was a large segment of the American population, I would say about 25 to 30%, that couldn't abide the idea that there was a black man in the White House. To them, it felt like a sacrilege, as if everything they stood for and everything they believed America stood for had been destroyed. And the hostility that Obama generated, the lack of respect he had in the United States by this 30%, was so shocking to me. I've never seen a more disrespected president than Obama. And I mean, people like McConnell, in the Senate, simply saying, our job is to block everything Obama does. We have no ideas of our own, but we will stop him. This is what they said. And then, this outrageous thing about the Supreme Court, how they managed to do this. Scalia dies. Obama has over a year left in office, and the Republicans wouldn't allow him to get his nominee for the new spot on the Supreme Court to come to a vote, not even to go into a hearing in the Senate. And Trump got his start in politics in a big way by what? The birther movement, going all over the country, saying that Obama was not an American, that he had been born in Kenya. At first, everyone laughed at him. And then he kept persisting. It went on for 5, 6, 7 years, Trump. And by the end of that time, I think something like 40% of the American public was on Trump's side. They believed that Obama was not an American. And I think this taught Trump the power of propaganda, the big lie. You just keep saying the same false thing again and again and again, and people are going to start to believe you. And now he's our president. But it all comes out of Obama, I believe.
Well, thank you. Before we finish, I do want Paul to tell us about your great aunt Marjorie.
Oh, you know about her too? Oh. Well,
she was Scottish, wasn't
she? She was Scottish, yes. Well, I did have a great aunt who was from Edinburgh, and I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. Now, my grandmother, who came from Eastern Europe, moved to the United States in 1900. She was 5 years old, and she had an older brother, Ben, who married Marjorie. Now, they lived in California, so I hardly ever saw them. But Ben apparently did well. He made money in real estate or whatever, and then they retired. And for years, the two of them, they were a crazy, eccentric, wonderful couple. They traveled around the world. They went everywhere you could go, but very cheaply, tramp steamers. They didn't take the luxury way. They went in the simplest way possible. And then after they finished traveling, they moved back to Los Angeles, and they opened up the first art house movie theater in Southern California. Kind of interesting also. And after my grandfather died, which was 1979, I was taking care of everything there. Everyone else in the family was gone, and they came. So I spent this incredible evening with Ben and Marjorie, who were old people then, and she told me all kinds of flamboyant stories about Edinburgh. And she talked to me about something that had happened when she was young here, a big fire in a theater in 1911 during, I think, a magician's act. And I always thought she was making this up, but it's true. There was a big fire in a theater here in 1911. She also read my palm and read my tea leaves. And all her predictions came true. So,
huge thanks to Paul and for finally making it to the wonderful Edinburgh Festival. About 15 years ago, I hopped on a subway from Manhattan to Brooklyn and hand-delivered a letter from the then director of the festival, Catherine Lockerbie, pleading with him to come. Finally, Nick achieved it. So I think that we all know and feel it's been worth the wait. And I'd like to thank all of you for being such a great audience. And Paul will be signing books in the signing tent, which, as you know, is next door, so please come and join us. But first, please, can you give us a moment to get there ahead of you? And, I should remind you, you can stay and go to the cabaret bar and drink and have fun all into the small hours, so please do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.